Hello. Today we'll be speaking with Karen Bailey, a talented Canadian artist who has taken part of the Canadian Forces Artist Program, a program that places artists into military spaces for inspiration for their work.
Hi, Karen.
Hi, David.
So just to start off, what drew you to that program?
Well, initially, it was a girlfriend of mine who suggested I apply. My friend is Carol Marois, who was in the program in 2005, and she paints people, and I paint people. And so she suggested this would be a really good fit, especially knowing that I paint behind the scenes and under-recognized people.
How would you describe the application and going through just getting approved and at that start point?
Well, I think when I filled out the form initially, it was quite a detailed form, and I had suggested that I would be interested, of course, in under-recognized or behind-the-scenes workers. And as far as I was concerned, I had no interest in going outside of Canada at all. I would be happy to stay at DND headquarters in Ottawa and paint the cafeteria staff. Or at DND, they also had a medical facility in Ottawa. And I thought, well, I'd be happy there as well, just documenting dentists or the medical personnel there. Uh, Maybe going to Petawawa, but that's about as far as I thought. And really, that process in itself was not difficult. Filling out, explaining my reasons for applying and how I went about applying. What was difficult, and I'm sure we'll discuss this later, is actually getting to Afghanistan because that's many, many more documents are filled out for that process.
What was your feelings when they said, "Hey, I know you want to do this, but how about we send you to Afghanistan?"
Well, it didn't quite work like that. First of all, they said that the D&D medical facilities were had been closed and they just did minimal work there. And the cafeteria at D&D headquarters in Ottawa was now manned by civilians. And so they said, well, think about some other idea. And actually, I kept hearing about Landstuhl um, on the news, and probably you're familiar with Landstuhl in Germany was where wounded Canadian soldiers would be sent after being wounded in Afghanistan. They'd be sent to Landstuhl and then be sent to Canada from there. So the idea was that I would go to Landstuhl and document Canadian military personnel there who'd been injured and perhaps travel with them on the medevac back to Canada. So that was the main possibility, and I was waiting for news of possibilities to go to Landstuhl. But the incidents that happened were never quite the right fit for my purposes. They really didn't feel that either there were too many injured soldiers, or there were maybe not enough, or there were just it wasn't going to work out. And they had in the meantime told me and told the other artists accepted in the program, we are not sending artists to Afghanistan because we can't get the insurance. And I was absolutely delighted when I found out that not going to Afghanistan, because I should explain that I have multiple sclerosis and
Mhm.
it's relapse remitting, so I can get sick and then get better, but pretty stable overall. And but one of my MS attacks led to an extreme case of vertigo, and I was hospitalized, and it meant that I suffer from motion sickness. So the prospect of going to Afghanistan was a nightmare to me. So I was delighted at the prospect that yes, I maybe Landstuhl sounds fine. So it turned out that it ended well. It ended up Afghanistan was where they did want me to go, and it was their idea because one of the heads of the medical services here in Ottawa with D&D, really wanted me to witness the miracles that were happening at the Roll 3 hospital in Kandahar, at the Kandahar airfield. And that was run by the Canadians. And they were just so, I guess he was determined that I should witness what went on, because what the medical personnel were doing was so absolutely remarkable. And he felt I had to see it for myself. And so he set about persuading me by showing me a video about what was going on at that hospital, introducing me to a military captain who had served as a nurse there, and really successfully, as you can see, set about persuading me that it was that I was really going to be inspired by what I would witness at this hospital. And he was completely right.
Once you got there and you actually saw everything and actually took it in, how did that make you feel?
Well, I think you don't have time to think, because it's, you hit the ground running. I knew I was going to be at the hospital for 1 week and I was going to be there every day. That was it. And I wanted to sketch as many of the patients. I thought I'd be able to sketch the staff, but they worked so fast it wasn't possible. I was able to sketch the interpreters and some of the security personnel. But I really didn't have time to think, because I was just working flat out the whole time I was there.
What was your process? So you get there, you see everything, you're going ahead, you're doing the sketches, but how would you translate that to the images? Because I've seen your work, it's amazing. There was one that really stood out for me, was when the little girl's holding the man's hand and she's, getting sort of fixed up. I can't imagine again what it would be like to seeing stuff like that and just putting it now into art.
Yeah, I was able to, I photographed while I was there as well, because I needed as much reference as possible. But that little girl, I was able to sketch her a few times. She was, in fact, the first one who modeled for me, which was really special. But I will say about that image, that little girl was 8 years old. And I should point out that at the hospital, it was filled with Afghan civilians who'd been injured as a result of IEDs or explosives, gunshots. But it was also inhabited by children. So there were children at that hospital in the next bed to adult men. So that was, for me, that was a real shock. And everyone who was in the hospital, if they were there, it was because they were really seriously injured, seriously wounded. And the one very hopeful thing is, if you arrive at the Roll 3 hospital, I think they had something like a 95% chance that you would survive, because the care was so comprehensive. So when I began, say, that little girl who her family's home had been attacked by the Taliban, and her father was killed. Her mother had to quickly remarry her uncle, of course, so there's support in the family. But this little girl suffered shrapnel wounds all over her body, and she had a particularly damaged leg. And at the hospital, the doctors felt she was going to have her leg amputated, because it didn't seem to be healing at all. So weeks went by and they tried everything. It wasn't working. Finally, one of the nurses, who in fact, Captain Bruce Reeves, who was the head ward nurse at the time, and he was the one responsible for my care when I was there. He was the one who thought, why don't we try a skin graft process with this little girl? And what they did was make an incision in her healthy leg, and they tied her two legs together at the ankles. and the healthy skin on her, her healthy limb, it grew on to the injured limb, and it was repaired in that sense. Then they surgically separate the two. So for 3 weeks, she had her legs tied together at the ankles, but that allowed the skin to grow and cover the wound. And I was there at the hospital the day she walked out of the hospital, which everybody was, they were in tears. They just couldn't believe that was going to happen. And in fact, the one thing I will like to point out is that she didn't have a very good relationship with her uncle, who was now her father. In the painting, I included one of the interpreters who had children of his own. He was wonderful with the children and doing the interpreting. And I sketched him a few times, and I wanted to include him in a painting. But of course, knowing the situation in Afghanistan, it didn't look exactly like him, but he knows it's him, and I know it's him because he was the one who was really involved in her care. So that's special to me that I was able to include that in that scene.
Wow. It was an impressive piece, but to know the background behind it just puts it in a whole new light.
Well, one thing I should point out too now is that that particular interpreter, all the interpreters were given uh, aliases, false names. So in this case, he was Tony. So I just thought of him as always Tony. Well, I kept in touch with Tony after I left and would send messages, email. Because I'd sketched him, he wanted a copy of the sketch, that kind of thing. So we were in touch. Well, a couple of years ago, he was finally able to get out of Afghanistan with his wife and his children, and he has now settled in Ottawa. I never thought I would see Tony again, and it's just absolutely, to me, that's a real miracle that he was able to come to Canada and actually settle in Ottawa. Has a job, his children are at school. It's just great.
What was the what was the feel of the people to Canadians there? Did they like the Canadians? Were they wary?
I had no idea because I was in that hospital. These were really wounded, ill patients. So it was through the interpreter that I was able to ask their permission to sketch them because I always ask permission in Pashto, and thank the Manana was the only word I could say in Pashto, but that's the only thing I would say to these wonderful men and children who posed for me. So I was able to sketch them, but I have no idea what they thought about Canadians. Certainly, you could tell they were appreciative of the medical care that they were getting there. That was one thing for sure. And I know that, as I say, there are many of the interpreters have been able to leave Afghanistan and are in touch with a lot of the military personnel that they knew from that time.
A lot of your work has, the people that don't necessarily get the biggest spotlight usually. You go and you focus on highlighting people who again aren't the biggest in the limelight. They're sort of behind the scenes. Um, why that focus?
Because there are always going to be artists who paint the beautiful and the famous, and politicians or stars of some sort, or very wealthy people. They're always going to be um, artists that can fulfill that area. But I realize that it's the people that you see around you that are, to me, that are the most interesting. These are people in my life, people that have affected me. And certainly my experience in Kandahar was, well, it was second to none. And I really felt strongly that those men and women should really have a light shone on them, because whether they were x-ray technicians or a pharmacist or a nurse or a doctor or a surgeon, it was just so important that those people be recognized. I know often the military wants to kind of play down because everybody's just doing their job, but I think one thing I was really aware of was when I was there, every single day, the medical personnel go into the hospital and they look into the face of trauma every single day. I know not to make it seem as if the people who go, the soldiers going out in the field are doing anything, less important, but certainly um, there are times when soldiers, well, what that you probably be familiar with the term hurry up and wait. There are a lot of times that they're just waiting for something to happen. In the hospital, there was something happening every single day. There were always injured people brought in, and these are really serious, serious injuries. So I think that a lot of those medical personnel came back to Canada with PTSD. And I'm not surprised because what they witnessed was that they were on a trauma unit for 6 months at a time. And some of them did several tours of Afghanistan. So you can't escape from the pain of that, the emotional pain.
Did you, I know you mentioned earlier that you have MS. Um, I imagine being in a stressful situation like that, did it cause any kind of worry or sort of any kind of physical ailments while you were there?
When you asked me about forms to fill out before I left, the medical form I had to fill out was pages and pages, 10 pages, every doctor I'd ever seen in my life. And that's when I had to disclose that I had MS, which I thought would rule me out of traveling to Afghanistan. But I do have, well, at least at the time I had relapse remitting MS. I now have secondary progressive, but at the time it was, I guess, less benign. If I had an attack, it would be treated and I would recover generally. And I had been stable and I was taking a daily injectable drug. So I'd be traveling with my medication. And they were wonderful about accommodating me. They said, you're going to be in the safest place possible. You're going to be in a hospital. So I felt completely reassured about that. And also, I was able to take time to rest. And even though they had initially given me a schedule when I arrived of what they thought I could do during that week, I knew I would never have the energy to do all of those things. So I adapted it to suit my body. For me, I was surprised because probably you may or may not know that with MS, heat is the worst thing for heat. So, and as the days went on, when they said you're going to Afghanistan, initially it was sort of springtime and spring turned into the beginning of summer. And I didn't end up going until the end of June, beginning of July. It was the hottest time in Afghanistan. So uh, I, I felt like I was being maybe it sounded like I was fussy to be concerned about the air conditioning, but I really need air conditioning. And I was fortunate that I was in air conditioned accommodation when I was there. Um, and the hospital was air conditioned, and I spent as little time as possible outside. So I did all things right to make sure because it was so important to me. I wanted to get all the information, get everything I could for this project because it's just a really important project, and I wasn't going to let um, having MS stopped me from going to Afghanistan and doing this project.
We've talked about you've sketched and then from the sketches you do the paintings. Is there anything else about like I believe you work in acrylic?
Yes, I work at acrylic, and I usually, certainly for this series, I paint a warm ground, a burnt sienna underneath everything, and that I like that to come through a little bit in the work. So my work isn't completely representational. It's in the sense that it's not photographic. You know, you can
Mhm.
see exactly what's going on in the work, but there's still some places for interpretation, say, and I have to admit that I do my paintings of the military personnel and the patients and the hospital, they're not harrowing because I think I didn't see that as a harrowing place at the hospital. I really felt it was uplifting because I knew that all of those patients were so lucky to be there and be in the care of those really talented medical personnel. So I wanted my paintings to reflect a positive sense, not a positive sense of war, because it's not about that, but it's about, yes, there's going to be war. We have to accept that. But if there can be medical personnel to care for the wounded and to heal people, then I wanted to paint that healing environment.
When I was going through your work, I'm an illustrator myself, and I focus a lot on storytelling. A lot of it old-fashioned, old fairy tale books.
Yes.
I also am a big comic book guy, so like sequential art and storytelling is a big thing for me. And when I looked at your work, I understood that. It wasn't it wasn't about, like it wasn't graphic, it wasn't um down or morose or anything. It was very uplifting, and it was serious matters, like serious things in your paintings, but they told a story, and I got that, which I was really happy to see because it feels complete.
It's really important that I am telling that story. And what, just as a kind of aside, but um, when I had my first exhibition of, I call Triage, my Kandahar work, I invited the Governor General at the time, Michaëlle Jean, to come and see the work because I knew she'd been twice at the hospital, the Royal Free Hospital, to visit during her time as Governor General. And so she came to see the exhibition and loved it. I was really inspired by the work. And she took me aside after having viewed the work and asked if I would paint her official portrait. And I was so honored. But I remember thinking, oh, but really the kind of paintings that I do, it's not glorifying people in the way that you imagine a governor general or someone posing for an official portrait. But of course, it transpired that she wasn't interested in a traditional portrait. She told me she wanted all of Canada in her portrait, and she ended up with 19 figures and one dog. And I was able to include three of the medical personnel that I met when I was in Kandahar. I included them, an X-ray technician and two nurses who were standing right next to Michaëlle Jean in their uniforms from Kandahar. And I just felt it was important because that had been all part of her time as Governor General.
Where was that displayed once it was done?
Oh, it's at Rideau Hall. It's
Oh,
the
okay.
official portrait of Michaëlle Jean. And it's the only one you'll see with all of those people in it. She really had a vision because she wanted to tell a story. She wanted the energy of Aboriginal youth in the painting. So I went to the Wabano Center in Ottawa and I met Aboriginal youth and invited them to come to my studio and dance for me and paint for me and do their creative work with me. And she allowed me to choose whoever I wanted to include in this. So there's a whole range of people. Anyway, as I say, there are 19 people. And the dog is her dog. And of course, her husband and her daughter, Maria Den, at two ages, because she wanted her daughter at age 12 when she had finished her tenure as Governor General. Sorry, no, it was her daughter wanted herself at 12. That's right. It was Michaëlle Jean who wanted her daughter looking 5 years old at the beginning. So I ended up, all of which is to say, I painted Maria Den twice at age 5 and age 12 to suit both Maria Den and her mother. So that portrait tells a story because it's all happening at Rideau Hall with Norval Morissette's large painting in behind that was at the ballroom, in the ballroom of the Governor General's residence. She just wanted that sense of inclusion.
Mhm.
And so that's what I did. I tried to include as much of Canada as I could possibly include.
I'm just curious, doing the Governor General's portrait,
Yes.
again, as an illustrator myself, that would be such a highlight in a career. Just to have your name attached to doing something like that. How did it feel once it was done?
Again, well, it was a pretty special time. It took a year to do that portrait, and I realized it took a long time because there were so many figures involved. It was, as Madame Jean wanted all of Canada. So I did feel really special, but it was more what I learned through that process because I had no connection with Aboriginal youth before that time. And so it was as if Madame Jean was pushing me and pushing the limits. The other thing that really struck me so much was that because I still had this thing stuck in my head about what an official portrait should look like, about the
Mhm.
one person looking very grand and beautiful and up on a pedestal. And so it was hard for me to get my head around the fact that she wanted something quite different. And also the powers that be at Government House didn't really want her to have so many people. They just wanted one person in the portrait. So it really was a learning process for both of us, and I think a learning process for the officials at Rideau Hall. Um, and what really struck me was that Madame Jean, um, I kept coming up with roughs, and she'd say, no, no, no. She'd say, I'm too big in this. She said, I don't want to be bigger than anybody else. I want to be the same size as everybody else in this portrait. And then I would do it and everybody was looking at her and she said, no, 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 in the sketch. I don't want everybody to be looking at me. This is not what I want. And then another one, no, no, I don't want to be in the center. And I remember finally saying to her, well, how is anybody going to know that you're the Governor General if there are all these people? And she said, well, she said, I'm the only one wearing a white suit. So, because she was indeed wearing a white jacket and a white skirt in this portrait, and there it's true, none of the other characters were wearing a white suit. So she really, and the only person that was looking at Madame Jean, this was her husband, and she didn't mind that because she said he always, Monsieur Lafont always looked out for her, and she didn't mind him looking out for her. But she really didn't want to be the one in the limelight. She wanted everyone to be in the limelight. And I realized that's the kind of Governor General she was. Her time in office was everybody in Canada was important and special. It wasn't just about her, it was about everybody and shining a light on everybody. And so that's what I was able to include my uncle, who had been a vet. He helped to liberate the Netherlands in the Second World War. He's using a wheelchair, so I have him actually, he's in the center of the piece in his wheelchair, next to a woman who's a volunteer from a charity shop that I'd met, who'd been an ambulance driver in the Second World War. So she's as if she's speaking with him. So I was able to include, as I say, people from all walks of life, new immigrants, someone from Rwanda, someone from South Korea, new immigrants. It was a wonderful experience. So I learned so much through that whole process. So I would say Madame Jean gave me a wonderful gift in doing this portrait. Not everyone would like the portrait because it isn't what you expect to find, but it tells a story.
Mhm.
And that's what I wanted to do, and that's what she wanted to do.
Just to go from there, because we're talking about art and getting into it here. What artists do you like?
I trained in Britain, so I have to admit that I do look often to British artists for inspiration. Um, but I also realize that I am influenced, however much sometimes I don't want wish to be, but because of that training in Britain, um, I studied heraldry, calligraphy, and illumination uh, at art school. So we did, of course, some illustration as well, but mainly it was the heraldry, calligraphy, and illumination working with gold. So that's a very, I don't like to say narrow, but it's a very strict kind of art form. There are a lot of rules and regulations, let's say. And so, and very rigorous. So that was a wonderful training to have. But what I realize is that that has influenced all of the work that I do now, is having, when you think of medieval scribes and you think of knights going to war with their shields, and that's kind of, those are my early influences from art school. But it's more British painters of people that interest me. Of course, there are military artists in Canada who were remarkable too. There's an exhibition on right now at the Canadian War Museum of women military artists. And that includes like Molly Boback, and there are lots of wonderful women who were part of a military program. And they're certainly an influence as well. But I think it's also being influenced by the people around you. I work in a shared studio. There are 9 artists. We each have a room in an old rectory next to an old church. And I feel like I'm influenced by the people I'm working with in that sense.
So your studio is in a church. Is it any of the stain like are you exposed to any of the stained glass or any of the architecture, or has that been remodeled?
No, we're in the old rectory where the priests lived, so we have rooms in
Oh.
in the rectory where, as I say, the priest next to St. Bridget's Church, which is now an Irish art center. Um, they have performing arts happening there, and music and dance and um, for all kinds of performances. But they've maintained all of the church furniture in the actual church itself because it's under heritage restrictions. So the church is exactly as the priest left it when they closed the doors the last time. But there's a church hall downstairs that are being renovated for performances. So it's a pretty special place, and it's just about a block away from where I live, and I live right in downtown Ottawa. So it's a really yeah, it's a remarkable place to work in um, because it's full of history.
I can just imagine, like, especially with calligraphy as being one of your cornerstones, to then be surrounded by sort of like medieval looking type of architecture. That must be awesome. Like that must be great.
Yeah, it's funny because I know that when I was studying calligraphy and heraldry, I had my heraldry tutor always said to me, because he taught illustration as well, he said, you know, you can do a lot more than just paint heraldry, Karen. And I'm so glad he said that because I came back to Canada and for several years I just painted heraldry, family coats of arms and coats of arms for towns and cities across Canada. And I did calligraphy, special documents, whether it was for government or private individuals. Um, but I realized that there was more to life than painting, calligraphy, and heraldry, and that training was a really good, like springboard almost for doing other things. So I had a good rigorous training, but then I went on, because of that, I went on to do book illustration in Ireland for a publisher based in Belfast in Northern Ireland. And I illustrated a book, first of all, of heraldry. And then once they saw my portfolio, they realized, oh, she can do other things besides heraldry. And they asked me to illustrate a book of Irish proverbs with using calligraphy and little drawings of animals and things with the proverbs. And then they saw other work that I'd done and they said, oh, maybe you'd like to illustrate a cookbook. So then I started illustrating cookbooks. But one thing, kind of getting back in a sense to the military work, is I've done that. And then, of course, I went on and I was painting people. I was doing courtroom drawing for Global Television and for the newspapers here. So I was doing lots of different things. As an artist, you know yourself, you have to be kind of a jack of all trades. And I did have a really good training so I could do that. But it was what I found doing the military work was that often when people, if you say you're an illustrator, they don't really understand that, or it doesn't have the same kudos or whatever. It's one thing. I could say I was a calligrapher or a heraldic artist or an illustrator, and that's one thing. But as soon as you say you're a military artist, all of a sudden people think, oh, they say, oh, and they're interested in that. And in a sense, it wouldn't matter about all the wonderful books you'd illustrated before. It was that the fact that I'd gone to Afghanistan, and then I spent 2 years after that preparing the triage series, and that's what sticks in people's heads, and that's there's a kind of respect you get from that. I don't think that's always right, because there are other series I've done and paintings and commissions I've done that I think are equally important. But it's just there's something about military art that people seem to really be drawn to.
I think it's because it's so unique. Like we can talk to other artists, we can talk to painters, we can talk to, all types of artists, but to have someone who has a military experience or viewpoint and is an artist isn't something that comes along that often.
No, you're right. You're right. And the one thing is, I realized I had a civilian written all over me when I went over. And I know this one experience I had when I was in Dubai it was actually at Camp Mirage, which was a Canadian camp there, and waiting at the airport to fly into Kandahar for the first time. And all of the soldiers were around, and there was a big pile of weapons, and they were all taking their weapons and putting, I guess they call it unready their weapons, so they were doing that. And this one soldier, he turned to me and he said, "Where's your weapon?" And I quick as a flash, I took a pencil out of my pocket and I held it up and I said, "The pen is mightier than the sword." And he just gave me this blank stare and walked away. This is so I was a real fish out of water in that scenario for sure. But I do believe that's true, that the pen is mightier than the sword, because we're the ones that are telling the stories that last for centuries.
Mhm.
And war, if there weren't artists, war would not be documented. We would just wouldn't really know about it. If I mean, I know you can say that there are journalists covering things, but it isn't the same as, as an artist. It isn't the same as the musicians who write music inspired by war, or whether it's sculptures that are produced, or paintings, or literature, great literature that comes out of it. That's all that feeds the imagination, and that's what people really really respond to. And it really does tell the story of the military experience.
Yeah, I definitely see it in your work. That you touch on like a really good subject, the fact that without art, history wouldn't be documented because art brings a perspective. Just readings of facts doesn't really put you in the perspective of someone who's seen it, who's lived it, who's showing you their story. Art's the only thing that really can do that.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Well, we're gonna wrap up here, and I just was wondering, do you have any final thoughts on your experience as a whole? Anything you would want to say to people who are thinking about applying for the projects?
Oh, I would always highly encourage anyone to apply for this program. And I think it's just such an important program that the Canadian military has. And the stories that come out of it that artists produce, that's so important. And it's important for military personnel. I know when I was at the hospital in Kandahar, there were some, just a few medical personnel there I could tell who were thinking, what's an artist doing in a war zone? Because it was a small, cramped hospital and everybody was just working flat out. And I tried to be like a fly on the wall as best I could. But it was only later, some of those same nurses and doctors, I invited them to come to see my work, see my exhibition. And once they saw the paintings and saw themselves and saw their story, they felt completely differently about the importance of having an artist in a war zone.
Well, Karen, I just want to thank you again for being here and talking with me today. Just wondering if someone were to want to see your work or check out your publications, where could they find you?
Well, it's karenbailey.ca is my website, and that's the best place. Otherwise, I have books. I'm just about to have my books sold at the Ottawa Art Gallery in their boutique, but also my books are available at the Ottawa School of Art in their boutique right now. So that's where you'll find them. But it's been a pleasure speaking with you, David.
Same here. Thank you again so much for this.
You're welcome.